right, so welcome. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Kimberly and I'm a content marketer here at Whereby, and today we're going to talk about the secret to more productive meetings. So why have this discussion? Well, a lot of us are working from home and maybe some are even going into office, but we're looking at a permanently hybrid workplace. So in this new environment, how are we going to ensure that we have a good video culture? And so that's something that we're going to go into depth today. So before I continue and introduce our lovely speakers, we have a couple of house rules. So I know some people are still joining. So if you could keep your cameras off and your microphones muted. There will be time for questions at the end, so feel free to drop your questions into the chat box on the right-hand side or tweet your questions on Twitter at Whereby. So this webinar will be recorded, just to let you know, and we'll also share the recording with you all afterwards. We also highly encourage you to use emojis and reactions through the webinar. So if you hover with your cursor over the chat, then you'll see some emojis that you can use. So yeah, great. Okay, so let's get started. So today I'm joined by David, Product Marketing Manager at Notion, and Abby, Chief of Staff at Whereby. Welcome to the both of you, and yeah, feel free to give a little introduction.
Go ahead, Abby.
Hi, well, my name's Abby. I've been Chief of Staff here at Whereby for a year and a half now, and my job is to make sure that we build the business in the right way, and a big part of that is our internal operating cadence, and of course meetings play a huge part of that. My background's a mixture of tech, but also languages and culture. So I originally was a linguist before moving into tech about 10 years ago. And one of the things I most love about Whereby and this trend of video really is like how it's allowing us to work in a much more multicultural, diverse environment across different parts of the world. So David, for example, who's joining us from San Francisco.
Great segue. Thanks, Abby. Hey, everyone. Happy to be here. My name is David. I am on the team at Notion. I joined Notion 3 years ago when it was just a teeny tiny little company of 10 people in San Francisco. Now we are a company of 5 offices and 250 people across many continents, and it's been quite the interesting ride over the course of the past couple of years, of course. I've worked on both the customer support team at Notion, answering everyone's questions about the product and responding to folks over social media accounts. Today, I am on our marketing team focused on product marketing, which I selfishly think is one of the funner jobs at Notion because I'm the one who gets to launch new features, and everybody loves when their feature request has finally been shipped or the any pain points that have finally been addressed. So sometimes I feel like I get to be like the Oprah person of like everybody gets a new feature today, and it's a lot of fun. Looking forward to digging in today.
Great, thanks both for a lovely introduction. So today, as I said, we're going to talk about meetings, but we're also going to talk about like how communication has changed and how you can love meetings again. And Abby and David will go into more depth about their experiences at Notion and Whereby. And then they'll also be sharing some really cool insights that can help you and your team. We'll then also open up for Q&A and discussion. So this entire session will take about 45 minutes. All right, so let's go. So with rapid change in technology and COVID, video is needed more than ever to stay connected. And the shift to remote work has opened up a lot of opportunities in different areas, but it has also caused a lot of meeting fatigue, as you can see these people in the images. So yeah, we needed to find new strategies. And so with that, we also have a lot of tech that can help us in this new environment to help with video fatigue. And so we have, for instance, Notion for documentation. We have email and Slack for async communication and messaging. We have Loom for video messaging, Whereby for video meetings. And so there's a lot of things that we can use to help us in these hybrid environments. Sorry. And so we actually wanted to know more about meetings and understand different strategies that different companies are adopting. So we went out and we interviewed leaders from Asana, Abstract, Notion, HubSpot, Typeform, and Drift. And we wrote this book about how to have productive and better meetings. And so they shared their strategies and what they adopted to help their employees and teams stay motivated, connected, and energized. And this was necessary because expectations around communication changed, and video is part of that expectation. So I'm really happy because today David and Abby are going to talk about this, and they're going to share their best practices and what are some of the things that they've learned and how they have adopted that with their teams and companies. So now I'd like to pass it over to David, who's going to run through how they do things at Notion.
Great. Thank you, Kimberly. Obviously, it's been a big couple of years for all of us. Was certainly the case at Notion. I think in March 2020, we had around 30 employees in one office. And we kind of prided ourselves on having this more or less no meeting culture. We really believed in the power of, and the value of having everybody share a roof every day, come into the same place every day as a team. And, you know, we felt very strongly about the value of like, let's have everybody come into the office. Like, of course you can work from home if you need to, but like, if you're able to, please come in every day. There's a lot of value in being able to turn around in your chair and just like tap someone on the shoulder. And especially for more like technical discussions and questions, can be a lot easier than something over Slack or Zoom. Of course, everything was turned on its head in March 2020. And we very, very quickly had to figure out not only how do we meet the needs of all of our brand new customers who are using Notion for their own remote work needs, but how can we scale as a company internally and figure out how to build this muscle of like actually having meetings for things, which is not a muscle that we had built very much as a result of kind of our no meeting culture. And I think we saw a pretty huge increase in Slack usage. Things got a little bit more difficult to keep up with in Slack. And there was certainly kind of a proliferation of meetings that took place as Notion scaled, not only the number of employees, but also the number of offices and time zones that were represented as well. And I think one thing that I learned as part of that exercise of scaling both the employee headcount and learning what it was like to host more and more meetings for things is that meetings don't have to be this thing that you dread. You know, a lot of people have this, there's always this kind of like, hey, did this really have to be a meeting today? Like, couldn't it have been an email? Couldn't it have been a Slack post if everybody's just going to read their like status update? But I realized that during the pandemic in particular, procrastinating became a lot easier. Personally, I'm a huge procrastinator. Like, I will move mountains to meet a deadline like the night before something. But when you're not showing up to the office every day, your boss isn't coming by your desk and asking you what you're up to, it's even easier to procrastinate in this hybrid environment. And so there's actually a lot of value in having that, you know, 10 a.m. meeting slot on Thursday or whatever it is. It's kind of a nice forcing function, both for yourself and for other teammates, to actually get that deliverable done so that you don't show up to the meeting with no progress to share. Another kind of challenge that we encountered as well is that if there's any kind of meeting where we wanted to make sure that we're following the same structure over and over again, or we wanted to kind of reduce the amount of work that it takes to host one of these like big cross-functional meetings with stakeholders from lots of teams, is that we needed to figure out a way to standardize the format for any kind of recurring meeting. One example of that would be like a retrospective after we ship a feature or after a big project wraps up. We want to make sure that we're meeting afterwards to discuss like what could we have done better, what went really well, what should we change for next time. But you shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel every single time someone runs one of those meetings. And so using our own products in Notion, we created templates for all of these different meeting types so that anytime that someone wants to run an all hands presentation with the whole company, or a retrospective with other teams, or a weekly stand up with the engineering team for sprint planning, all of those different types of meetings already have a format stored in the template so that everybody is very easily able to create their meeting right away and stick to the same format that everybody else is using for more consistency. And then with that, I'll pass it off to Abby.
Thanks, David. There's so much of what you're saying that I really agree with. I think in particular, this notion of templates and just consistency and repeatability. When you're thinking about so much of the conversation about why meetings have been tiring in the past couple of months have focused on videos, and video is the tool by which most people are having meetings. But if we're honest with ourselves, we all hated meetings before we had to have them all over video for the most part, even if we were doing it in person, largely because they're generally not well run. In the same way, a lot of people have a lot to say about managers. It's often because they haven't necessarily had experience of a great manager. So sometimes it's helpful to check on, is the problem the meeting or how are we running the meeting? Or is it the tool? Of course, you and I would say these things because we are responsible for these tools, but I think it's helpful to stop and take a step back sometimes. And we Whereby are by no means always best in practice at this. And I think one thing I want to stress to everybody participating in this is these have been an extraordinarily difficult couple of years, I think, for many people. And so the idea that we're all going to embody best practice every single day, day in, day out, is possibly a bit aspirational at times. So I think from our perspective, it's trying to keep things simple and just making sure that any meeting that we're having is meeting just a kind of minimum threshold. And the biggest challenge for us, outside of the things that you've talked about, David, in terms of having that consistency and repeatability of templates, is figuring out, when you're a distributed team of 103 people on basically every continent, apart from Antarctica, coming soon, possibly, is how do we make meetings work across all of those different time zones when we're doing them in a synchronized way? There's also the aspect of cultural differences, communication, and how do you make them inclusive? So there's loads of different considerations in our operating context. But the three questions we always try and check on is, first of all, like, do we have time to have this meeting? Is there a time that makes sense? If there isn't a time that makes sense, is there a way that we can do this synchronously? So one of the things I think it's helpful is, rather than ask yourself, is this meeting a valuable use of our time? When often the answer to that question is yes, is this the most valuable use of our time based on the priorities that we have this week? And often when you stop and reflect on that, you don't even pass that first barrier. So I think as a starting point, that's probably a good question to run by. Do we have time, and is this the most valuable use of our time? In particular for managers who have to spend more time in meetings than others, often at the expense of focus time and follow-up, making sure that they are having enough time in their schedules to actually implement a lot of the things that the great ideas, the decisions, the problems that are being solved in meetings is pretty critical. So I think thinking about the overall balance and what it means for different people is a first step. The second question that we ask is really like, am I ready to have this meeting? So once I've established that it's a valuable use of my time and I'm convening everybody into a room, am I going to be able to get the most out of that? So one of the things for us is just thinking about preparation and making sure that everyone is coming in with a clear understanding about what kind of meeting it's going to be, and so they can get the most out of it. And this is actually one point that I think is really interesting, because we talk about meetings as though they're this homogenous thing. But actually, when you think about it, meetings are quite different in terms of, I guess, the taxonomy. So you have decision-making meetings, you have problem-solving, brainstorming, collaboration meetings, you have one-to-one meetings, you have reflection and improvement meetings. And so how you go about conducting those, how you prepare for those, how much notice you need in advance is actually going to be really, really different. Like, you know, events, webinars, the folks who are running classes, for example. Yeah, like Lynn is just saying in the chat, if you're presenting a learning session, you need to have real clarity on quite a granular level about how long each section is going to take, all the different steps in the process. So I think figuring out in advance what kind of meeting you're having is also going to be critical, because it's not really a one-size-fits-all approach. And then the final thing, I guess, is kind of delayed gratification, or another way of putting it is like, is there another way of doing this? Is there another way of solving for whatever we're trying to solve for through this meeting? And as I was saying before, if actually your meeting is maybe a reflection and improvement meeting, some of that might need to take synchronously, but a lot might be able to be done in advance asynchronously using tools like Notion, for example. So I think when it comes to like being thoughtful about whether or not it's the best medium for the thing you're solving, one of the reasons people default to meetings is because it's just easier. Let's get in a room and figure it out. But if you haven't got clarity beforehand about what success looks like in terms of having it, like there's you're highly unlikely to actually make it a good use of everybody's time. There's so many good questions coming through, but I don't want to dive in just too early to this. But I think we have a situation where, like David, we're heavily reliant on our own tools internally, and we're basically power users of our own tools. So we're always using them and thinking like, how can we make this better? And for us, like I think the emphasis on recognizing the limits of what the tool can do and what we have to do as a company and as a culture is probably more deeply ingrained as a result of that. I don't know if it's the same for you, David, sort of recognizing the limits of what's the tool and what's down to the team.
Yeah, certainly. I think obviously two tools that we use quite a lot at Notion are Notion and Slack. And I think things that go in Slack tend to feel a little bit more urgent and a little bit more disposable. Things that go in Notion tend to feel a little bit more canonical, a little bit more long-term and important, and a little bit less urgent. So I think to your point earlier, Abby, about asking yourself that question of like, do we really need to have this meeting, and is there a different way to have the meeting? I think a mistake that a lot of people make, and certainly a mistake that we've made many times, is that you think like, well, let's just do async. Let's just do something asynchronously. And I'll do that by writing up a doc, and then I'll post up a Slack, and then I'll post it in the Slack, and then everybody's going to want to read my like super long doc about this very specific thing. The reality is there's a lot going on in Slack. It can be very distracting. Not every single person on the team is going to be reading every single thing in Slack and reading everybody's documentation. Everybody's clamoring for attention in this kind of hybrid or remote world. And so I think something that we found particularly impactful is that for folks who do have an opinion to express about a particular topic that might be in a doc, they're welcome to leave their comment. But we have a culture where we have a type of document that we call a request for comment, RFC for short. And what we'll do is in the documentation at the very bottom, we'll create a little mini database where we request feedback from specific people like, hey, you specific person, I'm looking for your feedback on this doc. Here's your little space where you can leave your feedback. And then add a couple more people who are like, hey, optional to leave feedback here. No worries if you're not able to get to it, but we would like to get your thoughts. And then anybody else who wants to leave their feedback is welcome to, but they're just not necessarily called out. So I think I've learned.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, especially as a scaling team, because once you get into the hundreds, it's just not possible to get everybody in one room at the same time, especially in this distributed context we're talking about, who might have something really valuable to contribute. And when you're a bit small, you can probably get away without an RFC, request for comment kind of doc, but certainly once you get larger. Interestingly, if anyone is interested in getting hold of an RFC template, if you Google HashiCorp, they've actually made their templates available online as well. I'm sure Notion probably also have some fantastic templates in the work that you could use, but there's a lot of pre-existing templates you can just borrow, which are really fantastic, and save you a lot of time because you don't really need to reinvent the wheel. But one thing also that you said that I think is super relevant when we're thinking about that tech stack of Slack and Notion and Whereby is this sort of permanence versus frequency axes, right? So you've got some communications that are high permanence things that you want people to be able to access for a long time, and they need to have somewhere like Notion to live in. So for example, one of the things we do is we record a lot of really important meetings that we have on Whereby, and then we upload it into Notion so that it's easy for folks to find in our like internal communications section. Lynn, I can totally just type that in for you right now. Bear with me 1 second.
Yeah, and quick plug, I saw someone else asking about templates too. This is now a super shameless plug, but Notion just relaunched its template gallery like a week or two ago. It's at notion.so/templates. There's over 200 templates in there for any use case imaginable. There's plenty on the notes and docs and meeting notes side.
I don't think it's a shameless plug at all. I think it's fantastic. I love Notion's templates. It's very exciting.
Okay, great. So if anyone has any more questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. But I would really love to know from both of you, how do you balance meetings and getting to know your colleagues? Because, we, in a hybrid environment, we don't have that face-to-face contact. So David, you mentioned, rolling your chair over to your colleague and just having a small little chit chat. And Abby, yeah, we've been remote first. So like, how do we ensure that we just don't fill our calendars with meetings after meetings, because yeah, video is a nice way to get to know your colleagues. So David, do you want to go first?
Yes, I have lots of thoughts on this topic. So I think I actually just heard someone yesterday use the term digital equity, which I thought was really interesting. In a kind of hybrid and remote world, it's a lot more difficult to build up that FaceTime with your colleagues. You don't get the effect of like, oh, your boss noticed that you were like first in the office and last to leave. Like that doesn't exist anymore. That ability to kind of like build rapport with people in person has changed quite a lot. So when we're all virtual, like how can you build that kind of like equity and reputation within the company, those personal relationships? I think part of that has to be super intentional, especially for things like an all hands presentation, for example. That's such a valuable opportunity to get FaceTime and buy-in when you get to, present your project or your specific initiative in front of the whole company to get them all aligned on something. Being extra intentional about asking yourself like, hey, maybe the quiet individual contributor on this team who doesn't usually present, or maybe they don't come into the office because they're remote, like they should be the ones to give this presentation and give them a little bit of an extra spotlight. And I think maintaining those like personal relationships with your colleagues and kind of establishing that rapport with people. Of course, it is a lot more difficult over video chat than it is in person sharing an office together, but it makes a huge impact on actually getting work done. So of course, it feels nice to like chat with a colleague and, oh, maybe you have a couple things in common and, oh, you like dogs too, whatever. But I had kind of a light bulb moment very early on during the kind of remote shift that occurred. There's someone on our team who is very, very clued in to user issues at Notion. They're constantly looking through Twitter. They're constantly looking through our customer service tickets, and they have a really good feel for any kind of issues that are bubbling up to surface to our engineering and product team to fix really quickly. And so they post a lot in our product feedback channel on Slack with like, hey, notice this thing is happening. Hey, notice this thing is happening. Is anybody available to fix it? And what this person noticed is that the engineers who responds to these posts in the feedback channel are the engineers that they've had a personal chat with, whether it's just like we use an app called Donut over Slack. I'm not a huge fan.
We use it. We use it too. It's a mixed blessing.
Yeah, I think, 15-minute, 30-minute time slot just for the express purpose of like, let's have a personal chat. Like sometimes it feels a little forced, but the reality is like the more that you're able to build those like personal relationships, it really helps to, there's a lot less friction in getting work done together. And so that used to take place at Notion through these kind of in-person interactions, maybe going out to lunch together, going out to like team dinners, building that rapport. All of those personal relationships spill over into the workplace with the serious business stuff as well. And then there's one more tradition at Notion that I think has made a pretty big impact on the way that I kind of perceive my coworkers and how we work together. The reality is, as much as we tell ourselves that this may not be the case, it's really easy to make snap judgments about people, especially when they're like just joining the team. There's a new person joining the company. They drive a certain kind of car, or they went to a certain college, or they have a certain job title, and you start to make these snap assumptions, or not judgments, but just kind of assumptions about like what their life might be like, what kind of person they might be. So we have a tradition at Notion. We call it life, excuse me, we call it Life Story. It's completely optional and opt-in. And every Friday, we all take 30 to 45 minutes of a break and watch someone give a presentation in a Notion doc about their life. People are welcome to structure those presentations however they like. Some people do it chronologically, showing their baby pictures and, high school all the way up to present. Some people have structured it in like, hey, here's all the people in my life that made an impact on me. Some people have structured it with like, I'm just going to talk about the music that I like for 30 or 45 minutes. And you get an idea of like, oh, wow, this person had quite a like zigzaggy career path. They did this thing and this thing and this thing before they wound up in Notion. They haven't always been an engineer. Or here's the values that this person finds really important. It's interesting learning about people's grandparents and people who come from immigrant families and their struggles coming to the US. And all of these things put together really give you a lot of empathy for your coworkers and help you understand them on a little bit of a deeper level. And I think all of that, of course, it's great to get to know people personally, but I think it really does help in a business context when you're trying to get work done together.
Yeah, I think you're touching on, there's a guy called David Rock who has a model for employee engagement which is SCARF, the acronym SCARF. And he talks in particular about the R stands for relatedness. And I think in a remote context, this is one of the hardest challenges, or when you're collaborating primarily digitally, because relatedness is basically the foundation of trust. And I don't think it's one of the tensions between trying to avoid really transactional meetings where, you might leave. And this kind of goes back a bit to the premise of this conversation. Like I was reflecting on this morning, like what does a productive meeting look like? And I think even the term in a way, productive, is a little bit of a hangover from when we were primarily industrial economies. And as we shift towards knowledge economies, what does productive mean in that context? Because it's not necessarily about output or volume of output or high yielding, right? Actually, it might be something a little bit harder to measure, a little bit more qualitative. And so I think actually our amazing marketing leader, Nacho, and I were talking about this in a different context the other day, but some of the most impactful things you can use your time for in a meeting or in marketing efforts are not necessarily things that you're going to be able to measure immediately or even if at all. And I think relatedness and trust building is probably one of those things where I think if organizations become overly fixated on trying to make everything templatized and everything, very clearly measured, very specific outcome, you just crush the possibility of serendipity and you crush the possibility for humans to just connect person to person. And I think in the current circumstances, it's really challenging because a lot of people do have a lot of pressure on their time outside of work. I'm a working parent, so I would love to spend much more time talking to my colleagues than I can justify because of the hours of childcare available to me. But I still am increasingly like trying to find time at least for 3 half-an-hour chats a week with people I haven't met in the company yet, because to me it's so important that, especially the folks that maybe feel less seen, to your point about digital equity, maybe they're in one of the countries or the time zones that's a little bit on the fringe. Maybe they're an individual contributor rather than a manager, so they have a bit less of a platform. Maybe they joined quite recently in a wave of a high number of hires and might have got lost on the noise. So we have this tradition, when you join, we have a channel called the Lobby in Slack. So people are giving a little bit, sort of like a summary version, David, of your life story, where immediately you get a nice insight into who they are, their hobbies, where they're based. And that takes a big leap forward in terms of just getting a feel for them as a person. But I think it's then that follow-up piece. And one of the things, there's a great article recently, I'll see if I can find it, about building trust in teams. And I think it's so two-way, right? You have to bring in people who are comfortable in a remote context where they're maybe less likely to be able to meet people, with the idea that the people on the other end of the screen are probably trustworthy to start off with. And then you have to then behave in a way that confirms that faith and builds on that pre-existing trust. I think there are some folks who naturally find it harder to trust as a starting point, and I think they are going to struggle more in this sort of environment, because you do have to take a bit of a leap of faith if you're not necessarily going to meet your colleagues very often or at all for months, if we have, extended pandemic, for example. So I think there's so many things, I think, that we're still in the process of trying to figure out how we can solve for with video, and serendipity is one. And as you said, integrations in Slack like Coffee Donuts it can be a great starting point, but then how do you figure that forward? But I just noticed Lynn in the chat, active listening. I think, I trained as a coach a couple of years ago, and I think this is also one of the things that can make the video piece really challenging, because when you are practicing active listening for hours and hours over the course of the day, that alone in person is quite tiring. And then when you layer on the fact that the absence of that non-verbal communication that you normally get from video is sort of heightened. But this is what I think is so exciting about videos. We're really just at the beginning. We're making strides all the time towards figuring out how we can solve for the kind of human points of failure, as well as the technological points of failure that make interactions less than optimal. And it's really both, right? It's a bit of all of the things we've talked about already today.
Yeah.
When it comes to video, I think we've seen a few studies already of the value of turning off your own camera, so that you're not like looking at your own face during the meeting. It's quite like taxing on your brain. But if you take that a little step further, particularly if you're a manager or you're the one leading the meeting, there's a couple people at Notion who have developed this skill. They're so good at it, of like always trying to pay attention to the kind of grid of video faces. And like, if you say something and you see someone like wrinkle their face, there's a couple people who are very good at being like, hey, I saw that you made this facial expression, like, do you have any thoughts on this thing? Especially if it's someone who's a little bit more introverted and quiet, or like, oh, hey, I saw that you took yourself off of mute for half a second there. Did you have anything to share? So having that extra little bit of empathy for folks who are maybe a little bit more quiet, paying attention to the other videos in the meeting to make sure that folks have an opportunity to voice their concerns.
I think that's a great point. And again, we're a mixture of facilitation skills like that, which were really valuable before everything moved online to video. Then it's trying to figure out, how do I carry that same skill set across into video, and where can technology help me, and how and user design help me, and where is it actually going to be about the individuals bringing their own creativity and talent into it. So I think we're still trying to figure out how that's all balanced across the board. But yeah, it's I think particularly for managers, that's going to be a real challenge. Like, how do you get to understand if someone's struggling, and how do you get to understand, and really, we talked about the relatedness and trust, and the good thing is, I think people are becoming increasingly aware of how important it is to, ask icebreaker questions, to do a check-in at the outset. Every exec meeting at the beginning of the week, everyone scores themselves out of how to 5, how are they feeling, and shares a little bit of context, so that as we go into that meeting, we haven't seen each other, we haven't seen them walked in hunch over, we haven't heard them sneeze, but we know the context that they're bringing on a personal level into that meeting, so it helps manage expectations then for the hour.
Yeah, and so I'd also like to touch up on empathy and also in the hybrid event. So environment, sorry, I keep saying event. Hybrid environment. So David, you say that you also have an office, but you also have folks that are working remotely. And so when you have meetings with people in the office, and then you have meetings with people who are not in the office, have you had, let's say, not enjoyable meetings, bad meetings in that situation? And like, what are the learnings from that? And can you share some of those learnings?
Absolutely. I'm a little bit biased. Personally, I think hybrid might be like the worst of both worlds in some contexts. There are some really painful meetings in hybrid contexts. One small example of this is that we've just moved into a new office, and we're still figuring out the conference rooms and the AV, the microphones, the cameras, all of the kind of meeting stuff. We're also figuring out how do we be a big company? We don't know how to be a big company yet. So one of the things is there's a certain type of conference room in our office where the microphones are just awful, really, really bad if you use the built-in microphone in the conference room. And the result is that all of the remote people in the meeting are going you can see them doing this the whole time. They're wrinkling their faces, and you can tell that they're really struggling to understand what's happening, which if it's an important meeting, that has some serious implications. So going the extra mile to if there are remote participants in a hybrid meeting and some people are in an office, by default, all of the remote people are second-class citizens in that meeting, and you have to go out of your way to make sure that they're included. Going out of your way to ask hey, do any of the remote folks have any thoughts on this issue? Or instead of using the built-in terrible microphone in the conference room, muting that microphone and using one of the microphones on your laptop. We've noticed that that's a great way to increase the audio quality for your colleagues. Not everybody does that. So if you've learned these kind of tricks that make the remote folks feel more engaged in the meeting, allow them to participate a little bit better, it's worth putting in a little bit of extra effort to make sure that it's a productive meeting for everyone.
Yeah,
that reminds me actually of something I think it was Lynn earlier touched on in the chat, in terms of when we talk about preparing for meetings, and where tools like Notion as well can be super useful. So we have Slack recently released the ability to pin things to the tops of channels, and that's really been a game changer for us. So we can, a lot of our recurring meetings, I'll pin the Whereby room to the top so people can very quickly jump in. I'll pin the Notion page with the checklist or template, and then link to any, for example, Google documentation where we might be having live sort of spreadsheets or things like that. And that just allows this, it becomes a one-stop shop basically for people, so they can get into the mindset and quickly find everything they need. But there's a fantastic book. If you can't tell, I love this stuff genuinely, and I need new and better hobbies. There's a great book called The Checklist Manifesto by a surgeon called Atul Gawande, and he talks a lot about the impact that checklists had on reducing the number of avoidable deaths in hospitals and surgery, having learned a lot from the way the aviation industry had improved safety. Now, this is not equivalent in terms of severity and impact. Nobody's going to die from a terrible meeting, hopefully, but I think that principle of figuring out what is the checklist. So if in the hybrid context, enough time before, how much time do we need beforehand to make sure the AV situation is set up? Which tools do we need to use to allow for this kind of stuff? And it's only a problem if you're having to do it from scratch every time. Once you've got a playbook, and I think particularly for anyone who's building a business in a fast moving market, or all of these marginal gains in terms of efficiency really add up and reduce cognitive load and just make life easier and more predictable for your team when they're having to operate in really unpredictable circumstances.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And also, I want to bring back to empathy and inclusivity. And also, Lynn has a question here, I think also related to that, is they state, one challenge is to understand when another person is actually finished with their statement. In other communications, they used to say over, but this is not really comfortable. So any ideas to help people not speak over each other?
Well, our emoji tool is incredibly useful for this. So one of the things, I think sometimes you see a sort of critical mass of very polite thumbs up being like, okay, yeah, we've got it, let's move along. But also in terms of talking over each other, sometimes people are unmuting just to say like, wow, that's a great job. But actually, if they can do a quick reaction or, you know, chat, like, it really, those kind of features really help, I think, prevent interrupting. It also just becomes a bit cultural, you know, as well. Like I think this is what, going back to the sort of the message I keep repeating, it's about how the tool and the team can work together. So using these features, but then also combining them with, you know, maybe, for example, setting some ground rules at the start about how you want to run the meeting. In some instances, you might be comfortable with interruptions. Maybe you just want to exchange a fast, free-flowing ideas, and it doesn't matter too much. But also to David's example about the amazing engineering manager at Notion who, you know, has a keen eye and an amazing peripheral vision for spotting wrinkled features. It's kind of like figuring out how can I pull those people in if I've seen them hovering over mute a few times. But aggressively muting people mid-meeting is not something we tend to advocate for, but certainly having great facilitators, you know, at the outset set the ground rules and then follow up on them, I think is a big part of it. But yeah, not all communication needs to be voiced, right? I think so. It's looking at the other features and options you've got.
Yeah, and interrupting is hard. I know we're at time. Just one more thought on interrupting. I think the uncomfortable and unfortunate reality is that on average, women are interrupted way more frequently than men. And so I think when it comes to interrupting, it's really important that if you are a little bit more outspoken in a meeting, if you're the kind of person who is a little bit louder, a little bit more gregarious, people listen when you talk, it's really important to just be an ally for people who are being interrupted. You can do that by saying things like, oh, hey, before we move on in this meeting, I think Abby had something to add on the previous point. Abby, what were you going to say?
So I think thanks, David. I was going to say, this is also why we have the raise your hand feature, because for those people, this is also a nice way of doing that. So if the facilitator's keeping an eye on that, they can go, today, for example, Horvard's had his hand up a couple of times now. Horvard, did you want to say something? Sorry to interrupt in a highly ironic meta way.
No problem. Yeah, so we are reaching time, but if you have any questions for David or Abby, feel free to tweet them to us or email us at marketing. I'll share the email in a moment. But also, if you want to learn or read some more tips from other leaders from the companies that I mentioned earlier, you can download our ebook from this website. We'll share the link. Hannah has already shared the link in the chat. Thank you, Hannah. And we'll also email the link to you. But yeah, I mean, if you have any questions that you would like to ask Abby or David, you know, you can always reach us at marketing@whereby.com. And I would just like to thank you both, David and Abby, for joining us here today. We could go endlessly and talk, you know, so much about this, but it's been really nice to hear from both of you and your companies. And yeah, I hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of their day wherever they are.
All right. Thanks so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.